When a massive disaster strikes, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is supposed to step in and provide aid. But history shows that FEMA's response is often slow, disorganized, and sometimes even counterproductive. In prepping circles, government aid is often seen as unreliable at best and a potential threat at worst. With a new administration in power, we may even see major changes to FEMA, possibly its complete disbandment. If that happens, what will replace it? And more importantly, what does this mean for preppers? Today, we're going to break down exactly what FEMA's role would be in a large-scale SHTF scenario, what you can realistically expect from government disaster response, and why self-reliance is still the best strategy. Welcome to Prepper's Paradigm, your channel dedicated to practical prepping and disaster preparedness. In this video, we're taking a hard look at FEMA, what it's designed to do, how it actually operates, and what preppers should expect if a real SHTF-level disaster unfolds. We'll also discuss potential policy changes under the new administration, including the possibility that FEMA could be downsized or eliminated altogether. Many disaster movies and books portray FEMA as an oppressive force, locking people in camps and confiscating supplies. But what's the reality? Will FEMA be there to help, or will it be overwhelmed and ineffective? More importantly, should preppers even count on government assistance at all? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly where FEMA fits into your survival plan and where it doesn't. The Federal Emergency Management Agency was never meant to be a first responder. Instead, FEMA's job is to coordinate disaster response and recovery efforts, primarily by providing funding and logistical support to state and local governments. That means FEMA doesn't just roll into a disaster zone and start handing out food, water, and medical supplies. Instead, it relies on local and state agencies to request help, and even then, it can take days or weeks before any meaningful assistance arrives. In a best-case scenario, FEMA provides aid after a disaster has already caused widespread damage. But in large-scale events like Hurricane Katrina, FEMA's response was riddled with bureaucratic delays, logistical failures, and mismanagement, leaving thousands of people stranded without basic necessities. For preppers, this means one thing: you cannot count on FEMA to save you in the critical first hours or even days after a disaster. If the situation is bad enough, FEMA may not be able to help at all. And that's just in a regional disaster. In a full-blown nationwide SHTF scenario, FEMA's resources would be stretched to the breaking point, leaving people on their own for an unknown amount of time. In a localized disaster, FEMA's aid might arrive within a few days, assuming state and local governments are still functional. But in a nationwide collapse, the situation changes drastically. When entire regions or the whole country are affected, FEMA will be overwhelmed and priorities will shift. Here's what preppers should expect in a large-scale SHTF event: delays in response. Even in smaller disasters, FEMA has struggled with slow response times. In a nationwide crisis, aid could be delayed for weeks or even months as supply chains break down and logistics become unmanageable. Urban centers will be prioritized. Government resources are typically focused on high population areas. If you're in a rural location, don't expect immediate help, if any at all. Restricted movement. In extreme scenarios, such as COVID lockdowns, FEMA and other government agencies could enforce travel restrictions, curfews, or even mandatory evacuations. This could mean roadblocks, military checkpoints, and ration access to fuel and supplies. Emergency shelters and resource distribution. If FEMA sets up shelters, they will likely be overcrowded, undersupplied, and dangerous. Crime, disease, and violence in post-disaster shelters are well-documented issues. National Guard and law enforcement involvement. Depending on the severity of the crisis, FEMA could work alongside the National Guard or military forces to maintain order. In some cases, this has led to confiscation of supplies, forced evacuations, and martial law scenarios. The takeaway for preppers: FEMA's role in a nationwide disaster will be focused on control, not individual survival. If you rely on them for food, water, or shelter, you're putting yourself at serious risk of being caught in a system that will be slow, inefficient, and possibly restrictive. Self-sufficiency remains the best defense. When FEMA does arrive, it will not be there to ensure your personal survival. It will be managing the crisis at a macro level, leaving individuals to fend for themselves. Many disaster books and movies depict FEMA as a sinister force, rounding people up into camps, confiscating supplies, and enforcing martial law. But how much of that is based on reality? Here's what we know. FEMA does have emergency shelters, but these are not designed as long-term camps. They are temporary shelters, often set up in sports arenas, schools, or tent cities to house displaced individuals. Shelters are overcrowded and under-resourced. Reports from past disasters like Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria show that conditions in these shelters can be poor, with limited food, water, sanitation, and security. Mandatory evacuations could become a reality. In large-scale disasters, FEMA may work with local law enforcement and the National Guard to enforce evacuations. If you're caught in an evacuation zone, you may have little choice but to comply. Confiscation of supplies is possible. While there's no widespread evidence of FEMA seizing personal preps, law enforcement agencies and the National Guard have historically confiscated firearms and restricted movement during emergencies. If FEMA is working alongside these agencies, expect enforcement measures to escalate in extreme situations. While FEMA itself is not designed to be an oppressive force, it is part of a larger government response system that may impose restrictions during a crisis. The biggest concern isn't that FEMA is actively out to take away prepper supplies. It's that it won't be able to provide for those who rely on it, leaving people desperate and vulnerable. For preppers, the best course of action is to stay off FEMA's radar whenever possible, avoid government-run shelters, have a bug-out plan that doesn't involve evacuation centers, and stay self-sufficient so you don't become dependent on an overwhelmed system. With the new administration in power, there has been talk of downsizing or even dismantling FEMA altogether. If that happens, disaster response will shift to a different system, one that may be even less reliable. If FEMA is eliminated or severely reduced, disaster response will likely fall into the hands of one of the following: state and local emergency management agencies. Some states have well-organized emergency services, while others are underfunded and inefficient. Without FEMA's coordination, the quality of disaster response would depend entirely on where you live. The National Guard and military. In large-scale disasters, the government could deploy National Guard units or active military to maintain order. This could mean curfews, travel restrictions, and potential martial law, especially in urban areas. Private disaster response organizations. Nonprofits like the Red Cross and faith-based groups may step in, but their resources are limited. They can provide temporary aid, but they won't be able to handle a true nationwide disaster. New federal programs. If FEMA is disbanded, it may be replaced by a different agency, or disaster response could be handed over to the Department of Homeland Security. This could mean more military-style enforcement rather than traditional relief efforts. For preppers, the message is clear. Government disaster response is unreliable, and it may become even more chaotic if FEMA is dismantled. Whether FEMA exists or not, large-scale disasters will still happen, and individuals will still be left to fend for themselves. If FEMA disappears, expect less coordination, slower response times, and more reliance on military enforcement rather than direct aid. The only real solution is to be as self-sufficient as possible. Regardless of whether FEMA remains in place or gets dismantled, the reality for preppers doesn't change. Self-reliance is the only way to ensure survival. Government aid will be slow, unreliable, and possibly restrictive. The best course of action is to assume that help will not arrive and prepare accordingly. The first priority is stockpiling enough supplies to be fully independent. FEMA recommends having 72 hours worth of food and water, but that's nowhere near enough for a major, long-term disaster. Preppers should aim for at least 3 to 6 months of food storage, along with multiple ways to collect and purify water. There's a link in the video description to the food quantity calculator on our website at preppersparadigm.com to help you work out how much you need. Medical supplies are just as critical. In a large-scale emergency, hospitals will be overwhelmed, and basic medications may be unavailable. Having a well-stocked first aid kit, prescription medications, and medical books can make the difference between life and death. Power and fuel should also be factored in. Without access to gasoline, propane, or solar power, even a short-term disruption could become a major survival challenge. When it comes to shelter, preppers need a plan for both bugging in and bugging out. If staying home, Fortification should be in place to protect supplies and keep intruders out. If bugging out, planned routes should avoid main highways where government checkpoints or mass evacuations could create roadblocks. A reliable secondary location is essential, whether that's a rural property, a friend's land, or a well-hidden campsite. Another major risk in an SHTF event is restricted movement. If martial law is declared, there could be travel restrictions, curfews, or even forced evacuations. Preppers should be ready for the possibility that government agencies, including FEMA, may attempt to control where people can and cannot go. Staying under the radar is crucial. Showing visible signs of preparedness, such as stockpile supplies or an abundance of fuel, could make someone a target, whether by desperate civilians or by authorities seizing resources for redistribution. Beyond individual preparations, it's also wise to develop local self-reliance. While many preppers prefer to operate alone, having a few trusted contacts nearby can be beneficial. Bartering skills, security support, and shared information could be useful if the government's response leaves communities to fend for themselves. Finally, staying informed is just as important as physical preparations. If FEMA is dismantled or dramatically changed, preppers will need to watch for new policies that might replace it. Some states may handle crises better than others, meaning the level of government intervention, or lack thereof, could vary depending on where you live. Understanding how disaster response is structured at the state level could provide insight into what to expect if federal agencies fail. No matter what happens to FEMA, one thing is clear. When disaster strikes, the government will not be your safety net. You either prepare now or risk being caught in a system that won't have the resources to help you. FEMA is not your survival plan. At best, it provides delayed assistance to disaster victims, and at worst, it becomes another layer of government control that preppers will have to navigate. History has shown that even in regional disasters, FEMA's response is often slow, inefficient, and burdened by bureaucracy. In a nationwide SHTF scenario, those failures would be magnified, leaving people waiting for help that may never arrive. If FEMA is still in place when a major crisis hits, preppers should expect restrictions on movement, overcrowded and unsafe emergency shelters, and a government response focused on controlling the situation rather than ensuring individual survival. If FEMA is disbanded or replaced, disaster response will likely shift to state governments, the military, or private relief organizations, all of which will be even more limited in resources and capabilities. The only real solution is self-reliance. Whether FEMA exists or not, a large-scale disaster will mean shortages, civil unrest, and disruptions to essential services. Those who are prepared with food, water, medical supplies, and alternative shelter plans will have the best chance of staying independent and out of harm's way. At the end of the day, the responsibility for survival falls on the individual. If you're watching this, you already know that depending on the government in a crisis is a risky gamble. So, what do you think? Will FEMA be an ally or an obstacle in a real SHTF event? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this video useful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our website at preppersparadigm.com for more in-depth prepping resources. Thanks for watching. Stay prepared. See you next time.